We're doing top teachings of Brachos Daf Yud Tes. The first teaching is about, can you embarrass dead people? Unfortunately, we have a very tragic situation right now where 9 people were killed in a helicopter crash in Los Angeles, and one of them was Kobe Bryant, and he was one of the best basketball players that ever lived. By all means, he was one of the most talented sports people, and in every way seemed to lead a fascinating life and a very rich life. And the question is, there was a story in many years ago that happened with him, and I'm not going to talk about what it is, but basically, is this a time for the news media or for people to talk about that alleged incident, which was in court, but was eventually, he was not found guilty in court, but it was settled out of court. And he did kind of make a partial admission, not fully saying that he was guilty of what he was charged of, but explaining how he could understand how the person on the receiving end could understand that what he did was against her will. You can look it up, obviously, and I'm not here to talk about it. I'm just here to say, can we talk about it? I'm asking a question. Is this the time to talk about something like that, or do we just talk about the positive in the man and leave that alone? I don't have a clear-cut answer on that. I'd say there are 2 ways of looking at it. The Talmud, first of all, in Daf 18, has an extended conversation about whether the dead people are aware of what's going on in this world. And the assumption is, if they are, the more aware they are, the more of an issue there would be to talk about them. In other words, if they know that you're saying not nice things about them, it's hurting them, and you are you would, in a sense, be hurting them as if they were alive. On the other hand, our Gemara starts out with a statement that says the following: Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak says that I'm number 1 here. Kol misaper acharei hameis kilo misaper acharei ha'even. Rabbi Yitzchak doesn't agree with that opinion that I just stated. He says whoever talks about a dead person, it's like they're talking about a stone. In other words, a person is no longer able to hear what they're saying. So, I mean, it could be you're insulting their family and their legacy and their friends, so you could be sensitive to that. But in terms of whether they actually hear you, as long as you don't, if you tell you and your friend talk about it and nobody else hears, it doesn't insult the family per se. You're talking about a stone, meaning they're inanimate, they're no longer aware. Now, there's 2 ways of interpreting that. One is they have no idea, because the dead people just don't know what's going on. The other is they do know what's going on, but it doesn't hurt them anymore, meaning they're in a whole other dimension, so what we think about them doesn't seem to bother them. Now, the Gemara challenges this and says, Eini. V'ha'amar Rav Papa chad ishtoi milsid b'asreda bar Shmuel v'nafal kanya matlala ubazal arnika democha. There's a story that's brought down about somebody at the funeral of Shmuel who was saying not nice things about him, and something like a pole basically either killed him or broke his skull open, which is basically would have normally killed somebody. So the Gemara responds, Shani Tsurba Mirabanan, that when somebody is a sage, that's different. It's not necessarily that the person himself gets upset about their honor, but God is the one who demands their honor. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, anybody who speaks at the funeral of a scholar against them will themselves, that person who speaks badly will descend into Gehenna. The point being that there's two types of people there are regular people and there's scholars. When you badmouth a scholar, somehow it's considered like you're badmouthing God. God is on their side, so to speak. But regular people, they don't care, they don't know, or they do know and don't care. Now the problem is obviously, the question is who's a regular person? Is a scholar somebody who studies Torah? Or is a scholar anybody who does good deeds or is considered a good person? That's one question. Obviously, some people would see a scholar in the very narrow sense of literally somebody who is not just exemplary in action, but also a Torah scholar. And that leads us to number two, which is, should we assume a scholar who sinned did tshuva, which is related to number one in a sense, which means, when do we assume that somebody who does something wrong, it's an anomaly, it's not really who they are, they fixed it, or when do we not know, and when do we continue to feel that person needs to fix themselves? Which leads us to number two, which is the following. Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, they taught in the academy of Rabbi Yishmael. If you see a scholar, a Torah scholar, who sins in the evening, don't continue to think that he is a sinner during the day. Shema, perhaps asa tshuva, he repented. The Gemara asks, Shema sakadaitach, is it a possibility that he did tshuva? Elavade asa tshuva, wouldn't it be for sure? Of course he did tshuva. So the Gemara actually says correct. A scholar who sinned, we assume that they did tshuva by the next day. V'hani mili b'dvarim shebegufo aval b'mimona ad mahader lemare. That only applies when it's something with their body, but when it comes to monetary things, we don't assume that they fixed it until it's clarified that they return the money to the owner. So if the person borrowed something or stole something, we don't just assume a Torah scholar, they made amends. No, we have to go and use legal recourse or verify that they actually made amends. Very interesting that we make that distinction. I want to talk about for a moment this thing about Laila versus Yom, night versus day. Everybody knows that night usually could be referring to either something that's covered up, so that could be something like a sexual transgression that's more likely to happen at night, or it could just refer to the part of the self, the dark part of the self, meaning the part of the self that a Torah scholar is a human being. A human being has a Yetzer Hara, which encompasses, the Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination, which encompasses many different types of potential for sin. The Yetzer Hara could be simply the sense of narcissism or ego, in which the Talmud scholar puts themselves above other people in a way that's not holy, in a way that's not according to the Torah. And then the question is, do we assume that unholy moment, perhaps a moment of a temporary insult, is something that we should forgive them with? Or would that be like a monetary dispute, where you don't assume the monetary dispute is resolved until that's verified? And do we wait for the Torah scholar to apologize to the person they insulted? Probably I'd say the latter, because probably when you insult somebody, it's similar to money in the sense that you can fix it by simply making amends, although I should say it never is as quite simple as it sounds, because there's usually two sides to the story, which would mean, for example, as a rabbi, occasionally I have to control a room, for example, from a potentially unruly crowd, and I'll have to ask somebody to be quiet, and they may be insulted, but the other side of that is letting people just, take over a room and ruining it for everyone else. So it's a delicate balance. So when people are insulted, it doesn't necessarily mean the rabbi is mean and rude and obnoxious and uncaring, you may have to balance out the reality of the situation from the different perspectives. So that's why I would say when you can give the Torah scholar a benefit of the doubt, instead of just assuming the worst, perhaps you should. Okay, that's a little bit about number 2. Number 3 is, once we talk about bad-mouthing, there is a continuation, a continuum of our initial conversation that's leading over from the earlier page of Talmud, which is talking about dead people. And we're going to continue to talk about dead people for a moment, and we're going to talk about a story about 2 sages, Shmaya and Avtalion, which they were the heads of the Sanhedrin, of the Beis Din, towards the end of the Second Temple period. They were before Hillel and Shammai in terms of understanding what time period they served in. And they were converts. Either they themselves were converts or they descended from converts. So let me give you a little bit more background here to the story. Since we're on the topic of insulting or not insulting the dead, and the Talmud just established that you cannot insult a Torah scholar, we mention that there are 24 times that the Mishnah has a case. I shouldn't interrupt my Torah study, but there's a hawk flying across the street. I'm on Riverside Drive. I know I'm not supposed to do this, but it's all part of Torah. Okay, we missed it. The hawk just flew away. Back to Shmaya and Avtalion. Technically, I'd be very guilty of high crimes for doing that, according to the Mishnah and Pirkei Avos. Okay, so God should forgive me. So it's all part of Torah. Nature is also connected to Torah. So let's talk about the 24 times in the Talmud that they gave a form of excommunication. The Talmud here records 3 stories, and the first is that of Shmaya and Avtalion, which was the following. There was a debate centuries later about whether or not a woman who converts to Judaism would have to drink the sota water. What is the sota water? It's a very strange story in the Bible that talks about a woman who is suspected of adultery by her husband, and he had actually, prior to that incident, suspected her of having some affair with a specific man, and he warns her. He says, I don't want to see you seclude yourself with this and this individual. She does not listen to his warning, and she does seclude herself. So there's some form of evidence that not that she did anything, but she acted improperly. Witnesses will verify that she did seclude herself. We don't know what happened. Maybe they were just talking. Maybe they were doing something more than talking. Now, he doesn't know. He's besides himself. He doesn't know. Obviously, there was a breach of trust. He doesn't know what happened. We don't usually do anything. We don't, let's say, well, let's assume that she's an adulterer and make them get divorced. Instead, we had something that was miraculous called the sota water. She would go to the temple. There was a whole ritual where they would prepare a scroll that was written specifically for this occasion. That scroll would be erased into water from the temple. Some earth from the temple would be mixed in. It was a magical, miraculous potion of sorts. And she would read this curse that if she had this affair, she'd be guilty, and then she'd drink that water. Now, if she got sick and eventually died, it could take a while, she would be considered guilty. If she did not get sick and die, she'd be considered innocent, and she could be with her husband. By the way, a woman did not have to drink the sota water. The woman could say, I opt out. The only thing is, by opting out, she would have to get divorced, and she would lose her alimony, which was a significant thing. So a lot of women wanted to drink the sota water, but a lot of women wouldn't want to drink the sota water. But apparently there was a whole debate about whether a woman who converted could drink the sota water. And that debate happened hundreds of years after Shammai and Naftalion. But the rabbis who argued on the individual sage, whose name was what's his name? Akavia ben Mahalel. Akavia ben Mahalel was one of the great rabbis who's quoted in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. I believe he is. So Akavia ben Mahalel, many years after the Sanhedrin, the High Court of Shammai of Avtalion, argued that the Giores could not drink the sota water, but the rabbis who debated him on the issue brought a proof from a story in which Shammai and Naftalion did have a convert drink the sota water. His response, alleged response, I say alleged, not everybody agrees with this response, is that he said dugma hishkua, which means they were like her, that's why they had a drink. In other words, it was an insult. They were themselves converts, so they wanted to just have converts be exactly like everyone else, and that's why they ruled with their own interest at heart, and therefore we cannot take their ruling as authoritative and binding. By the way, Maimonides does rule that a woman who is a convert does drink or can drink the sota water, in opposition to Akavia ben Mahalel, and like the story of the ruling of Shammai and Naftalion. But that brings us to another question. Maimonides and others, the Talmud itself, rules that you cannot elevate a convert to a very high position, including a position of a judge, never mind the head of the Supreme Court of the Sanhedrin. The question then would be, how were Shemaiah and Naftalion elevated to that position? In fact, there are verses that seem to indicate that you cannot elevate a ger to that position. They're not. It's simple reading. It's a rabbinic reading. We know that a convert cannot be a king, and so it's not clear from a biblical perspective that a convert can't be the head of some other institution. But that's a rabbinic reading in a biblical verse. Meaning it's an interpretation. So the question is, how could Shammai and Naftalion converts become the head of the Beis Din? So the answer, there's three possible answers, amongst others. One is they weren't actually converts, they descended from converts. The second is that they were converts, but it didn't matter because there was nobody like them. And yes, there is a rule that a convert can't be the head of something, but that's the regular rule. Meaning, if there's somebody close in stature to the convert, you pick the non-convert over the convert. But if the convert is so way ahead above everyone else, then the other people are not really fit to be the head, then you have no choice but to elevate the status of the convert. That's the second answer. The third answer, which I haven't seen, so I have to verify it, could be, usually I don't like to take a historical approach to Talmud, because Talmud doesn't really believe in history. We could talk about what that means more later, but Talmud has a very limited view of learning history and then learning from history, but rather it reimposes itself on history. But that's for another time. However, maybe, I say maybe because I'm not sure, I have to do more research into this, you could say that the rabbis in the time of Shammai and Naftalion did not yet interpret those verses in a way that meant that that a convert can't take that position. Later on, that interpretation became more prevalent, and then that became instituted as law. Now the question is, what happens retroactively to a law? That's a good question. So that's, again, a third potential. The problem with that is that you could argue like that for a historical perspective on Judaism will undermine much of Judaism and create a deconstruction of Judaism. If Judaism has to match up to the history books of modern day historians, we have a problem. So therefore, I would just say, then delete what I just said, if that creates a problem. I'm not sure. I do know that there are times where I've heard from Herschel Schachter that possibility does exist of a principle to not have been authoritative, perhaps. In other words, perhaps it was an opinion, but it wasn't yet the accepted opinion at the time of Shmaya Baptalion, and later it became the accepted opinion, and then, that it is what it is. But it didn't mean that it was always the law, even though it could have been an opinion that eventually turned into law. Okay, that's number 3. Number 4 is Choni, the circle drawer, hero or rebel. Now, what is the story of Choni? So I mentioned before that the Gemara is talking about 3 cases where rabbis were either put or almost put into some form of excommunication. The first case that we already just talked about is the case where Shmaya and Naftali were insulted by Akavia ben Mahalo, and Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion of, God forbid to say, Akavia ben Mahalo was put into excommunication because he was the most God-fearing Jew of his time, and instead he learns it out to be another rabbi, Rabbi Elazar ben Chanoch, who made fun of the institution of washing your hands at Tilas Yadayim. And they put him into some form of excommunication. But definitely the story of Choni Hamagel is that the Choni was a circle drawer. He would draw a circle around himself, and then he would make demands on God. One of the famous stories is there was a drought, and Choni drew a circle, and he said, God, I'm not going to come out of the circle until you make it rain. And then it really rained a lot. So the problem with making demands on God is there's a restriction on iyun tefillah. Most of the sages understand that to mean when you make demands in prayer. In other words, who makes demands on a parent? An immature child who says, if you don't give this to me, I'm going to throw a temper tantrum. So in that sense, Choni was just like you're not allowed to be disrespectful to a Torah scholar, how much more so you can't be disrespectful of God. And by disrespecting God by making a demand like a child with an ultimatum, I'm not going to come out of the circle, you are disrespecting God and worthy of being put into some form of excommunication. And that's why Shimon ben Shetach said, if you weren't Choni, meaning you're something very special about you, but if you weren't so special, you're deserving, you would be put into excommunication, into nidui. There's the different words for excommunication. They have slightly different details in their application and so on. One is nidui, one is chayrim, shamta. So usually here, I'm just going to use the word excommunication. Now, so was he a hero or was he a rebel? Hero, he is considered a hero. Even Shimon ben Shetach says, if you weren't so special, meaning he acknowledges his amazingness. Yet on the other hand, he was a rebel. He pushed the boundaries with God. He demanded certain things. So here's how I'd like to explain it based on a number of other great people who pushed the boundaries with God. Yehuda and David HaMelech. The Ishbitzer Rebbe explains that these figures were always pushing boundaries with God. But he explains that there's a concept of a court jester. And the court jester, what they do is they really get up in front of the king and they do a stand-up routine that includes mocking and mimicking the king. So guess what? If you or I go and mock or mimic the king, we would literally be put to death. But when the court jester does it, he also he puts his neck on the line. The king could decide to put him to death, but what usually happens is if the court jester is any good, is he gets the king to laugh, even at himself. And if you could get the king to laugh even at himself, not only do you not get killed, you get rewarded. So Judah, David, and Choni Hamagal have something in common. They push the boundaries, but they win. God likes something about them, and even though they do things that by any other standard would be considered inappropriate, God rewards them instead of punishes them. So the question is, are you a rebel that deserves to be punished for rebelling, or are you a rebel that is appreciated and in fact a hero, and God actually likes your rebellion because you are Choni Hamagal, you're amazing, or you're David HaMelech, you're amazing, or you're Yehuda, you're amazing. And that's the question that we have to ask. We can't just be pushing, demanding things, because that's just arrogant and insulting. But do we do things in a way that somehow pleases God so much that He wants to give us what it is that we want because we're entertaining Him? And that's a deeper question about how to get to that level of where what you're doing and what God wants are so together that you can't even tell one apart from the other. That is number 4. Number 5 is the Torah is not in heaven. The tragic case of the excommunication of Rabbi Eliezer. And was it correct to put Spinoza into Cherem, to excommunicate him? So let's look at the Gemara for a moment. Number 5. The Gemara says, Va'ika d'Tanan. Isn't there another case of an excommunication by a rabbi? Chatcha chulios v'nasan chol ben chulia Rabbi Eliezer mitahar v'chacham tamein. We're talking about an oven. And what you need to know is that there are laws of Tuma that apply to vessels. The ancient ovens were vessels that you could transport, perhaps not easily. And the law is once a vessel is transportable and it comes into contact with Tuma, with impurity, it becomes itself impure. What if what you did is you cut some circles into the bottom of this oven, and then you put some sand in where the cuts are, and you refired up the oven. So the sand essentially would heat up and turn into some, I don't know, what does sand turn into? Glass or something? So the heated up sand would turn into some type of connecting things to connect the fissures, the cuts that had cut out these circles. So now the parts and the cuts were rejoined. So the question is, does this rejoining reconstitute the oven and make the oven into a vessel that is susceptible to tuma, or does it make it into something that cannot become mekabel tuma? And Rabbi Elazar says you don't have to, if that, I know the details are not interesting for most people because the laws of purity, for the most part, are not applicable to most people in almost all circumstances. Of course, there are exceptions. For example, the Kohanim today still have to conform to not becoming Tamei Lames. But anyway, the story goes like this. They're having this great fight about this thing. So Rabbi Elazar Mitar, he said it was pure, meaning it's not Tamei. The Chacham Mitam and the Chacham say it's impure. V'zeu tanuro shel achnai. This is the tanur of the circle. My achnai. Now I already said the cuts were in circles, but the Gemara has another interpretation of what these circles are. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Malam shekafu halachos ke'achnai. Zeh. They achnai also means a snake. There's a concept of a snake that's swallowing its tail. By the way, the Zohar and many other ancient books of literature talk about this concept of the snake swallowing its tail. There's a cosmic concept of a snake swallowing its tail, which is in Kabbalah is noatz, Tchilatan v'sofan v'sofan v'tchilasan. There's kind of this combination between the beginning and the end. Connection between Matzon and Malchut. That's a little bit of basic Kabbalah stuff, not necessarily something we need to get into. But this concept of the snake swallowing its head means they circled him, which means they didn't let up. Everything he said, they had proofs or disproofs to disprove him. They surrounded him with laws, like this circle snake, v'timu, and they declared him this case to be tameh, this oven. V'tanya, and we learned, Osa hayom aviu kol tahara shetari Rabbi Elazar v'sefer lefanam. They brought all of the things that he had purified based on this ruling, and they burnt it, meaning they showed that they considered it tameh, impure. And since he didn't back down, they put bechua usually means blessing, but it's a euphemism for putting him into excommunication. So the Gemara answers afilu hachi nidim masnisin lo tznan, that this is a brisa, it's not an omission, that's why it's not counted in one of the three cases, even though it is in fact a form of excommunication. And the Gemara says, what are the 24 places? It says those who believe that there are 24 places extrapolate what they are. Maimonides, and brought down the Shulchan Aruch, has another way of the 24 places are not particular rabbis and incidences as much as based on the Talmud, the Maimonides, and I don't know who was the first one who came up with what the 24 are. If somebody before Maimonides possibly did, the first place I've seen it is the Maimonides, come up with 24 scenarios in which somebody is supposed to be put into or should be put into a nidui, a form of excommunication, which leads me to the second part of number 5, which is, was it correct to put Spinoza into cherem? Well, I did not have time to really look into great detail about Spinoza. I have read about him and his cherem many years ago, so it's not something that's fresh on my mind. I'm just kind of vaguely familiar with it in terms of all the details. But I will tell you, many rabbis think that cherem, as time went by, was something that should not be practiced. And the main reason they felt that it should not be practiced is because it was counterproductive. The cherem used to work in the sense that the cherem used to make people feel like they have to fix this thing and then they would come back and be reintegrated. But as time went on, it seemed that the cherem would only make the person more angry, more upset, and more likely to not return, and sometimes it would lead to actual bloodshed or potential bloodshed. And the rabbis had been discouraging it from a while. By the time Spinoza was excommunicated, it wasn't a widespread thing to put people into cherem the way it probably was in earlier times. So while I don't know the answer as a fact that they should definitely not have put Spinoza into cherem, I would arguably say that they should not have, because that wasn't an effective way of dealing with people who they didn't agree with at that point. And that form of cherem, the only form of cherem I see as ongoing is usually have to do with hazmanot, which means based in court appearances, where the based in calls people to come and the person refuses to come. That's where I still continue to see issues of some form of a ban on the person. It's not widely seen as a way to get people to agree with your belief in Torah and so on and so forth. Okay, that's about 5. Now we go on to number 6, which is the concept of al tiftach peh l'satan, which means don't say negative things that will get the Satan, the dark side, to harm oneself by giving them a opening, so to speak. Now, what is that? The Gemara says the following, number 5. No, that's number. No, I just did number 5. I'm up to number 6. So the 5th is part of people who would say something called tzadok hadin. We still say some form of this today. Many people after the burial, which tzadok hadin really means accepting God as the true judge, even in this difficult time after a burial. And the Gemara says, the person would say the following: Ribona Olam, Master of the world, I've sinned before you a lot. Lo nifresi mimeno echad minei alf. You haven't paid me back, meaning I haven't been punished, even one out of 1,000. Yiratzum afanecha Hashem Elokeinu shetigdar pirtzasenu pirtzas kolam chabeis Yisrael berachmim. That may it be your will that you. I'm not going to translate that exactly, but I'm going to just say that God should be compassionate on us and Amar Abaye, lo mibaril le'inish l'meimerach. Abaye says, don't talk like this. Don't say that. Because you're mentioning to God that I haven't been punished enough. Like, why say that? Like, I deserve much worse than this. Just shut your mouth. Nobody asks you to say anything negative about yourself. Because by saying that, you're arousing the Satan. The Satan will say, look, he testified against himself, God. He's guilty of so much more. Why are you so nice to him? So by kind of saying things negatively about yourself, you are it's almost like, I think I do this sometimes, but I was recently at a comedy show. I produce a few comedy shows every year. And one of our, the chairwoman of our annual dinner happened to be at the comedy show, and she liked one of the comedians. And she went over to him after the show and she said, we love to have comedy at our annual dinner, and you were great. Maybe we should have you at our annual dinner. And what does the guy say? He goes, oh, the last annual dinner I did, I bombed. I'm like, wow, this guy is his own worst enemy. He's basically being offered a job to have an audience of 300 people at the Pierre or the St. Regis, and he's basically turning it down. He doesn't know that he's turning it down. He's just being honest, which I appreciate his honesty. But at the same time, how is this guy going to get ahead if he's his own worst enemy because he's putting himself down? So when you put yourself down, you might think you're being humble and truthful, but you also might be harming yourself, because you're bringing out the worst in you, and you could bring out the worst, you could bring out the best. So al tiftach peh means, it doesn't mean you should be like many people who take credit for things they have nothing to do with and are just liars, but it means don't always talk yourself down, not in front of God, not in front of others. Honesty, yes, but not extreme humility to the point where you're always trying to belittle yourself, because that could come back to haunt you on different levels. So that's number 6. Number 7 is about whether or not you have to tear off the garments of your teacher if he is wearing shatnez. Now, what is shatnez? Shatnez is wool and linen. In fact, I walked into somebody was very kind and gave me a very nice gift certificate to Brooks Brothers. So I walked in there and I said, I'd like to try on a jacket. And he looked at me and he said, he took my measurements. He says, you're wearing an undershirt and tzitzis. I'm like, yeah, that's right. He goes, you want it shatnez tested? I said, yes, I do. So what is he talking about? So shatnez, and the truth is, usually when I go to Macy's, I don't know. I used to have every cheap suit I got shatnez tested, but then after 15 suits all came back without shatnez, I stopped getting my Macy's suits shatnez tested. What is shatnez? But when I go to Brooks Brothers, which I don't do often enough, or when I go and get a nice suit, a nice place that costs over $400, I get it shatnez tested. What is shatnez? Shatnez is when wool and linen are woven together. Now, usually wool is, summer clothes. I'm sorry, winter clothes. Linen is summer clothes. And sometimes they will stitch into the shoulders of a fancy Italian suit some fibers of linen for whatever the reason is. So you should get that shatnez tested in the shatnez lab. Now, what happens if your teacher is wearing shatnez? Now, there are different ways of understanding this Gemara, because the Gemara doesn't say your teacher is wearing shatnez, at least not in our edition. But there were other editions that did have your teacher wearing shatnez, you should rip it off even in the street. Now, what's the problem with ripping it off in the street? First of all, what if all of a sudden they have nothing on underneath? Just maybe the person's half naked in the street. It's embarrassing, and usually you're not supposed to embarrass people. And there are limits on embarrassing people, even when there are Torah violations that the person might be doing. So what is going on here? So that's a good conversation. Let me first read the Talmud to you. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Hamotzi Klein big dough. Somebody finds shatnez in their own clothing, Poshton afilu bashuk. They should take it off even if they're in the street. My time, what's the reason? It's embarrassing to take off your shirt in the middle of the street. Ein chachma ve'ein tmuna ve'ein eitz l'neged Hashem. There's no wisdom, there's no understanding, there's no advice when something is against God. That's what we're referring to. Kol makom sheyesh chilul Hashem ein cholkin kavod l'rav. Anytime there is a desecration of God's name, you don't respect the teacher. Now, who is talking about a teacher here? There's no teacher mentioned. There's you. You are on the street. Are you the Rav? Whose Rav are you? Anyway, so some people have a different gear, so some people have a different textual case in which the person's teacher has a garment of shatnez. Other people understand that if you see someone else and you know for a fact that their garment has shatnez, you don't tell them to take it off in the middle of the street and they're going to be embarrassed. You don't rip it off. You follow them home. And when they're home and they're in the privacy of their own bedroom, or you say, my holy teacher, I know that this garment is shatnez. You're going to have to please take it off. At that point, no big deal. The person is at home, they take it off, they put on another coat, another shirt. So that's one opinion. The other opinion is you have to tell them to take it off. But the question is, there's two ways of understanding why they'd have to take it off. What prohibition are they doing? They put it on without knowing. So that could be the answer, that perhaps they do know, perhaps for some reason your teacher knows that they're violating the laws of shatnez and is doing it anyway, and you have to tell them. Well, that's kind of problematic. Why would a Torah teacher knowingly be wearing shatnez? Okay, I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps there's a metaphor in what shatnez represents, that it's much more than just an actual garment. Perhaps it represents a teacher who's using Torah in a way that's inappropriate or something like that. And they need to be censored. I don't know. It's perhaps has a hidden meaning. The other potential is that there's a debate about how to understand the prohibition of shatnez. Is there a prohibition when you put it on, or is there a prohibition of wearing it? If it's the second way, every moment that one wears it, one is getting an additional prohibition, and that might be the reason why you'd have to tell them to take it off, even in the middle of the street. Okay, so that's a little bit about not showing respect when something goes against God. And usually the Gemara is going to say there is a principle that says Torah does give way to kavod habriot, to the honor and respect that's afforded to human dignity. But like I said, that's not when there's a chil Hashem involved. Now, it's a good question. Why is shatnez a chil Hashem? Now, it could be because simply everyone else knows that this is shatnez. So perhaps that's a third or fourth way of understanding it. Everyone knows that this fellow is wearing shatnez, and if you let him continue to wear shatnez, everyone will assume he knows it's shatnez and doesn't care and is violating God's law, and therefore you're more obligated to embarrass him than allow God's name to be embarrassed. That's probably the most logical way of reading it. So then the question would be, when is there a chil Hashem? When do people say, oh, this person's violating the law, and that would take precedence over honoring and respecting the dignity of that person? That's a good question. So, for example, Um, I didn't know what to make of this. I had this conundrum first as a high school student and now as a rabbi from different perspectives. When I was in high school, occasionally somebody would be talking during davening during some part of the davening they weren't supposed to talk, and the high school principal would yell at them in front of everyone else. And I would often wonder about that. I'd think to myself, isn't there a law that says that kol ha'mevaza chavero barabim ki'ilu shofach damim, which means if you embarrass somebody in public, it's as if you're murdering them. And talking during davening, especially if you learned the Gemara in Brachos, many of the times during davening, talking is not nearly as bad as it became later in history. The Gemara was much more lenient about certain times during davening than we've become. So, is it right for the principal to yell at them? And I would say, but on the other hand, his perspective is if I don't yell at this person, then everybody will think it's okay, and before you know it, everybody will be talking during davening. So there are two concepts going up against each other. The worst case scenario would be some synagogues where the name of the synagogue jokingly has the word conversation in it, because there's so much talking that goes on in that synagogue that it's almost a joke, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to that synagogue because I want to talk. It's not about davening at all. So that arguably would be Chil Hashem. I'm not saying any one person talking is a Chil Hashem, but when the one person talking leads to the many talking, and the davening becomes a joke, then it becomes a Chil Hashem. So when does that one turn into the many? I don't know the answer. That's a good question. That's something that we struggle with. Somebody who's too strict for God's honor and doesn't care about people at all, that might be problematic. But somebody who only cares about God and insults everyone all the time, that also might be problematic. So there's a balance that I'm still trying to get right. I don't have the answer to this. I think it takes a combination of seichel and yiras Hashem, a combination of, I had people asking me to send out these terrible letters to tell people not to talk in davening or else terrible, like terrible things. I'm like, no, there's a Gemara that doesn't say that. Some rabbi says that. That's okay. Let that rabbi send out his own letter. I'm not that rabbi. But on the other hand, I understand the concern. So that's just one example about talking in shul, but there are many other concerns about many areas where people get lax about observance, and the question is which one trumps what. So that's part of this question about Chil Hashem, that ein cholkin kavod l'rav b'makom Chil Hashem. Number 8 is, while we're talking about the law about what gives way to what, we're going to go back to the origin of this, of where this Gemara is coming out of a Mishnah that's been talking about a case where there was a burial, and after the burial there would be nichum avelim. There'd be a time where people would line up into rows and they would comfort the mourner. Now, some of the Rishonim learned that this Gemara is a direct continuation of that exact scenario, where it's the comforting that happens after the burial, still in the cemetery with those rows. Rashi seems to learn that it would be like the next stage of mourning, where the Avel would be sitting down, presumably at their home, unless for some reason, sometimes when it's getting dark, and they're not going to have a chance to sit in their home, some people I've seen have a custom to sit for one moment at the cemetery, although I've heard that that's not necessarily necessary. Even having the rows of comfort without actual sitting is, according to many of the poskim, enough of the beginning of the Shiva process. So, the Gemara says the following. Tana Rabbanan, the sages learned. This is going to be amazing stuff you're going to learn right now. Shura haroa penima petura. the inner row, I'm going to learn like Rashi, of those who are sitting in the house of the mourner, and presumably some of them are listening or talking to the mourner. That row is Patura, is not required to say the Shema. V'she'ena roa panima, but the row that's not the inner row, meaning they're not looking face to face at the mourner or mourners, chayeves, they are required to read the Shema. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda either argues or explains. Habayim machmas ha'avel peturin. Those who are coming because they actually know the avel, either because they're friends, family, close. They don't have to read the Shema. Machmas atzman chayavim. But if they're coming because it's a spectacle, they want to go either see and be seen, or other people understand it because they're doing a mitzvah, but not because they actually know the person. They're just doing it out of honor, not out of a personal sense of connectivity to the mourners. Now, there are a number of ways of reading this. I'm not going to go through all of them because they're too numerous and I don't have time for them. But the point here is, wow, here is a concept of, it's not the mitzvah itself that you're doing, the act of the mitzvah, that dictates whether the concept of ha'osek b'mitzvah, pater min mitzvah, being involved in one mitzvah would allow you to pass up on another mitzvah. In this case, being involved in the mitzvah of nichum avelim, visiting the mourners, would allow you to bypass the necessity to read the Shema. It is also a concept of whether or not your heart is in the mitzvah, meaning, are you really there to comfort the person? Are you their friend? Are you listening? Are you just there as a bystander, as somebody who wants to do the right thing but doesn't actually feel the connection? Rabbi Soloveitchik in Rishimas Shiurim, as brought down by Rabbi Reichman, says the following concept, quoting the Rambam. Fascinating. The Rambam says that the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim is a rabbinic mitzvah, yet it is still part of Ahavas Yisrael, loving one's neighbor as yourself, which is a biblical mitzvah. And one way to understand it, Rabbi Soloveitchik suggests, is in this particular Gemara. When you go to visit the mourner, if you go as a bystander, you're doing a rabbinic mitzvah, and therefore you're still obligated to say the Shema. But if in your visit, your feeling of specific connectivity and wanting to connect and comfort the mourner in your heart is there, then you're not just doing a rabbinic mitzvah, you are loving your neighbor as yourself. Your empathy and your caring and you're wanting to hear and talk to the mourner and actually comfort the mourner, that becomes a biblical mitzvah that then sets aside the requirement to read the Shema. That's a beautiful teaching, which says you can do a mitzvah and then you can, but it's not yet, you're not yet fulfilling it on the deeper level. And therefore, the level that you're doing it on would not take away your requirement to recite the Shema. So I thought that was that's so rich. There's so many places to go with that. So we'll just keep that in mind. We're going to get to number 9, which is about when and when do we not violate things, mitzvot, out of respect for people. So the Gemara touches upon that here, and it says the following. A bunch of different cases here. One of the cases, what we just talked about, we talked about them in 7 or 8. Like 7, we talked about when we don't, which is the case of the shotness. Number 8 is when we do allow the mitzvah of comforting the mourners to override, under certain circumstances, depending on how close you are to the mourners, the mitzvah of reciting the Shema in its time. There are other cases the Gemara describes, such as the mitzvah to see a king, both a Jewish and non-Jewish king, that supposedly even a Kohen could walk over a field that once had a grave in it that was plowed over. It's called a Beis HaPras, Shenidish, a Beis HaPras, or a cemetery, if that's the way the mourners went under certain circumstances. And there's a discussion there in Tosfos about what that's talking about, beyond what we're going to be able to do today. Then the Gemara says, and leads us to number 10 as well, which is the prohibition of lo sasor. The Gemara says, Gadol kavod habrios shudocha lo saseh shabbatorah. Great is the honor and respect of people that it pushes away a negative mitzvah of the Torah. The Gemara says, Ba'amai, that seems to contradict another principle we just said. What about the verse that says there's no wisdom and understanding or advice when something goes against God? So the Gemara reconciles. Rav Bar Shva Kamei Rav Kana, this particular rabbi, interesting name, interpreted before another sage, Rav Kana. Belav de lo sasser. There's a prohibition against. The original meaning is talking about a zaken mamre, an elder, a sage, who refuses to comply with the ruling of the Sanhedrin, and the rulings of the Sanhedrin have to be heeded. And lo sasor, you're not allowed to deviate from them. The rabbis interpret lo sasor as a more broader verse to understand the requirement to listen to the rabbinic law. But basically what he's saying, when the rabbis interpret something, those interpretations don't need to be done if law human dignity will be impinged upon. But the Gemara understood it one way and questioned that. Achikola, they laughed at that. Lav de lo sasser raisahi. The way many rabbis understand this is lo sasser means when the rabbis use the Yud Gimel Midas Shatar and the Dirashas Behem, the 13 methodologies in interpreting the text to come to its true halachic application, meaning it's not the pshuto shel mikra, it's not the simple meaning of the text, it's a rabbinic methodology that extracts a law from that. But those rabbinic methodologies are not rabbinic at all. They're biblical. In other words, the rabbi, this is part of a more extended conversation of where biblical law ends and rabbinic law begins. But many times rabbinic extrapolation is considered biblical, meaning, yes, we wouldn't know it without the rabbis, but once they revealed it, that is now what the biblical text means, and violating that interpretation is violating biblical law. So they're laughed at that, at this seeming exclusion of things that are coming through rabbinic interpretation. So then Rav Kana says, Amar Rav Kana, Gavra Rabba Amar Milsa, Lo Techichola. Rav Kana defended his friend and says, when a great man says something, don't laugh at him. And he explains, we're not talking about rabbinic methodology of the attributes of how to interpret the Torah. What we're talking about is rabbinic prohibitions, when the rabbis added on additional prohibitions. Those things, there's an asmachta, there is a support, meaning it's not necessarily the actual meaning of the verse, but we take support from the verse lo sasser to also say on some level that you have to listen to rabbinic prohibitions. However, when the rabbis make a prohibition, they build into it that you don't have to have that prohibition when it impinges on human dignity. There's a lot to say about that, this idea of lo sasor. There's a great debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides, but unfortunately I'm out of time, so thank you for listening.